Welcome for a review of a knife that I've been thinking about adding to my collection for quite some time. And I wasn't sure about it, but I got a couple of really good recommendations from my friends. And you know from the title, we're talking about the Ka-Bar EK45. Not the Model 44 dagger, but the Bowie. Quick bit of history. John Eck started making knives for U.S. military servicemen back in World War II. He tried to sell his early designs directly to the military, but there was one design feature they didn't like, and we'll talk about that. But I'm going to say I am actually really impressed with this knife. In many ways, it has exceeded my expectations, but there are a couple of things about it that, well, did kind of disappoint me. Going forward, we're definitely going to be comparing this knife to my classic Ka-Bar USMC, but let's start with the sheath that it came with. They call this their Celcon sheath. The body of it's GFN, which might concern you. Is that going to dull your edge if it rubs against the material? Thankfully, the fit's pretty good, so my edge isn't actively rubbing against it. Haven't had the problem yet. Even though it says Ka-Bar EK on it, it does look a lot like the GFN sheaths they are selling for other 7-inch Ka-Bars. So, my classic Ka-Bar does indeed fit in this sheath, though it is a little snug side to side, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. But things I like about the sheath and don't like about the sheath. Comes with a pretty stiff nylon belt loop that is riveted on, so I can't remove it, swap it out. You've got about 2 inches of space for a belt, but between the stiffness and the length of the sheath, out of the box, it wasn't really moving with me. But over time, it's breaking in. It's becoming more supple. Also comes with this thumb brake top securing strap. If you've been watching other reviews, you know I really don't like these. They tend to get in my way more than anything else. But this one, I could rotate it and choose which way the brake happens. But I haven't been using it because the lockup, very positive, created by these hooks on the back plate engaging with the guard. So you slide the knife in and it snaps in very positively. It's not going anywhere. Also, because this is the same sheath for the Model 44 dagger, there's no directional bias, so I can stick the blade in either direction. I really like that option. And when it comes to release, when I'm wearing it from my belt, all I have to do is reach down, grab a hold of this. Well, we're going to talk about this nice long handle with a lot of real estate to grab a hold of. All I have to do is cant the knife away from my body a few degrees, and it releases very smoothly, which is awesome. In talking about the friendly end, bear with me because there's a lot to unpack here. So I'm going to start with a quick look at the classic, the awesome and the concerning. The awesome is the stacked leather grip with the finger grooves in it and the palm swell. Yeah, feels really great in hand, though some people might argue it's a bit too round for good blade indexing. We'll come back to that subject later. Got the thick round butt plate, which creates a nice flare for retention, and you might be able to use it as a hammer in the field. And I say might because this gets us straight to the biggest concern everyone has. The stick tang. It is full length. It does come out through the butt plate secured with a single pin going through side to side, but it is only 9 millimeters front to back. And a lot of folks have demonstrated how you could bend or break this knife at the tang. Now, Ka-Bar says that this is actually a design feature to allow the knife to bend and not break should someone use it as a pry bar. And I have a little bit of trouble believing that, but then I have to consider when this knife was designed and issued as compared to how, well, some of us use our field knives today for things that we would feel a whole lot more comfortable with something more substantial in terms of a tang. Which gets us to the EK designs, which are indeed true full tangs. Yes, I have taken the handle scales off. I'll put a picture up. So instead of 9 millimeters, you're getting front to back 15/16 of an inch, 2.5 centimeters. So theoretically, much more durable, and yeah, we're going to put it to the test. Also, you've got a longer functional grip on, and this is the same handle on the 44 and the 45. So where you've got functionally 5 inches, 12.5 centimeters here, which from my medium width hands is perfectly adequate. Here your grip scales are 6 inches, 15 centimeters, and that's not including the part of the tang that's sticking out the bottom of them, intentionally there to be an impact tool, which we'll talk about later. But before we get to the scales, let's talk a little bit about the guards. Now I have to qualify that my classic is a good 45 years old, so I don't know what the modern ones are like. But looking at them, you can see the guard on the classic, it's thinner stock. Also, even on the modern ones, these tend to come with their guards either straight or bowed slightly back both ways towards your hand. So one of the things I do to mine is I'll bend them into an S-curve. It's my own preference. Whereas the EK comes with it bent into an S-curve. And I really do kind of need it for indexing. Even though there are a lot of angles and corners which I expected to be sharp but actually are not at all. Front to back and side to side is pretty much the same, and also there's no taper bias front to back. So if I pick this thing up without looking, I really can tell where the sides are because I can feel the bolts. But I can't tell which way my blade's facing until my hand makes contact with the guard. How much of a problem is that in emergency martial use? You will talk about that later. But let's get into these grip scales. All right, they're secured with 3 robust bolts, which have some nice big slots in them, so you could remove or tighten them down in the field with an improvised tool. And that becomes important because, okay, the guard is actually removable. It's just kind of slid onto the tang of the knife, and it's held in place by the pressure of the scales up against it. So with impact, and yes, removing them creates enough breathing room that you get some wiggle. But the easy fix, because the holes in the tang are slightly oval, is I just loosen up the screws, shove the scales up against the guard, tighten them back down. Wiggle goes away, at least for a while, but yeah, it does come back. Or you could just take the guard off. And this is where we get to why the U.S. military declined the knife. They were requiring a knife with a guard to keep the soldier's hands from sliding up onto the blade should they use it to thrust or stab. And the original EK designs and some of the modern ones today, usually the shorter blades, they don't come with a guard. How much of a problem is that? Well, the shapes here are the classic EK design. Now this came with GFN scales, which they do look kind of cheap, but they actually feel pretty good in hand and they've held up well. You can get wooden scales. You can also get some fancy ones for about $100. It's a pretty pricey upgrade, or you can make your own. But the geometry here, this is EK signature. You've got some cutouts here, create sort of a palm swell in the middle, and he demonstrated that even without a guard, the knife was safe by grabbing a good hold of it and driving it hard into a table, and his hand didn't go anywhere. It still wasn't good enough for the U.S. military, but as we're going to see in the tests, that is actually true, and well, sort of not. Before we get into the blade comparison, which is very surprising, let me give you what I usually call my global stats, starting with what did I pay for the thing. Most everywhere, these tend to be going for around 120 US. And for that, I'm getting K-Bar's 1095 Crovan. That, my test files are saying, probably around 5758 HRC, which is consistent with my other K-Bar knives made out of 1095 Crovan. This one comes with a parkerized finish, like my classic, which is not very coarse. That's a nice thing. It makes it easier to clean, and I'm not getting that traction coating resistance going through certain kinds of materials. It's also held up really well to the use I've put it to so far. You might be able to see A little bit of, well, barely there surface scuffing. It's actually sort of polished itself a little bit with use, so that's all good. As for overall dimensions, the EK, because it's a shave bigger, is also a shave heavier than my Classic. So looking down at my notes to give you the metric as well as the imperial, you're talking about 10.5 ounces, 297 grams versus 10 ounces, 283. And again, I qualify that this is a 45-year-old version of the knife, so specs may have changed. Overall length, as expected, because of the difference in handle length, it's an inch. The EK is 13 inches, 33 centimeters versus 12 inches, 30.5 centimeters. Because of the full tang, it does move the point of balance a little bit further south, so it's right below the top bolt, a little bit into the hand, but then feel does depend on exactly where and how I'm gripping it, and we'll talk about that more in just a bit. Whereas on the Classic K-Bar, it's still down into the grip, but just not very far. It's between the guard and the top groove, so about right there. So the reason I put off buying this knife for so long was that looking at the pictures of it, I got the impression it was going to be, especially for a Bowie, long, slim, very stiletto-like, not very slicey, kind of like some of the European-style Bowies I reviewed, like this Puma, which is still an awesome knife. I like it a lot. But when I got it in hand, I was surprised by the dimensions that were identical to my Classic. Well, I knew the length would be. They're both 7 inches long, 17.5 centimeters. But I was sure the EK would be narrower front to back, and they're the same. You're talking 1.25 inches, 3.1 centimeters. Now, my 45-year-old K-Bar, remember how it had some trouble getting into the EK sheath? The stock thickness is a full 4 millimeters. If you have a modern version of this knife, let me know what your stock thickness is, because the stock thickness on the EK is 3.8. Just enough to give me some breathing room in the sheath. Is that going to create structural weakness as compared to my Classic? It's actually not the thing I'm concerned with. It's something else about the blade geometry that we'll get to. Talked about they both have these S guards. Now having a back guard on there does interfere with you getting your thumb up on the back for leverage for curving and slicing. On both knives you could just cut it off, or on the EK you could remove the guard entirely. But whereas the Classic has sort of a ricasso that is big enough to use as an index finger choil if you want to choke up, the EK does have what looks like an intentionally designed finger choil. It's a feature that I like. But the surprising differences on the plus side. Okay, so they're both flat saber grind, but look at the difference in the grind heights between the Classic and the EK. The EK grind is much higher. That is 11/16 of an inch, 18 millimeters, as compared to the Classic. That's half an inch, 13 millimeters. It's going to make the EK's edge geometry a lot keener, potentially more slicey, and you're going to see that in the test footage. But that creates a vulnerability when it comes to the tip geometry, which you can see on the EK is a lot keener, more acute. The false edge bevel goes further down. Now on the Classic, this one came with a sharp false edge without a secondary grind on it. The EK came with just a hair's blunt that I managed to make sharp without creating a visible secondary grind on it. So it's pretty awesome. But because of that keener tip and longer bevel, I wind up with a tip geometry that compared to the Classic is a whole lot slimmer, a lot less reinforced. And I have discovered that that is indeed a potential vulnerability. So let's get to the test footage. Quick edge test. Slicey. Breaking down the test results, starting with the Marshall set. The first one I did this time was the bamboo test, to see if I can induce chip or roll on a fragile edge by hitting a hard media at different angles, forward and reverse grip. The knife did fine. Under impact, the guard loosened up a little bit more, but otherwise no damage. Now, I'm not trying to chop through that media. It did bite in very impressively, though. Hitting it with the speed and rhythm I would normally use when I'm training sparring gives me a sense of how nimble the tool is. And yeah, this is a very responsive, quick knife. So since it has such a keen blade profile, I went ahead and did some small panel cutting. Gives me the equivalent of a small water bottle or pool noodle. And yeah, it did okay at that too, though I did notice in the media sometimes I would get some twist in my grip, probably due to the roundish handle shape. But then the tip test, this is where I got nervous. So starting with my Pell, which is multiple layers of thick cardboard backed up by a couple of inches of compressed brown paper bag paper, up against my redwood target. It's a media that gives me more resistance the deeper I go into it. And this is where I started doing a versus test against the classic K-bar as well. One thing I'm looking for, and I'm using 4 grips. Forward grip with the edge facing away from me and towards me. Forward grip with the edge facing away from me and towards me. Penetration and channel. Both awesome. Better than the classic K-bar, which has more of what I would call in my needle to shovel tip spectrum. It's a little bit closer to a shovel, made a wider channel but not as deep. But then straight into the redwood target, where I really started to get nervous with this keen tip. It is a test of tip durability, though I'm not trying to destroy the knife by driving it into wood, twisting it sideways. I do want to see how it will hold up to colliding with something harder than the soft material. And it also tests, the other thing I'm looking for, is how that linear impact translates back into my hands. Any uncomfortable collisions, how does it eat up the shock, and does my hand stay put? And frankly, I expected this to do worse. Well, first of all, the tip survived. It did get buried in that wood pretty deep. You can see in the video, I had a heck of a time pulling it out sometimes. But this is where John Eck's theory of hand retention really played out with one caveat. If I was using a full-fisted grip, so hammer grip in the forward grip in either blade orientation or ice pick reverse grip, my hand stayed put, stayed away from the guard, did not budge, and there was no discomfort in that collision. I was really surprised. It was actually better than the classic, which slipped in my grip a little bit. But if I get a little bit more, shall we say, subtle in the angles of the grip, if I went for more like a handshake grip or a foil grip, or especially, okay, a saber grip with my thumb too close to the guard, that's where things started to slip a bit. I lost some of that security. Now, I don't think I would have gone as far as sliding my hand up on the blade, but I would be more nervous if the guard wasn't there. But I did definitely move upwards because I was starting with my grip about in the middle, so that's telling. The test that scared me the most, though, and the one I actually thought it would do the best at, given how it's made, I thought it would be a great throwing knife. It doesn't seem to be balanced in a way that I can get a consistent rotation out of it, so I was having a lot of bad throws. Beat up the knife, loosened the guard, but didn't otherwise do any damage. It was when it actually hit tip on that I was worried about damage, because one thing I was noticing is it was rolling in the air. And what that meant was no matter which blade orientation I was throwing it at, it wouldn't necessarily consistently land in line with the mass of the knife. It might land like that or like that, and then yeah, especially if it didn't hit straight square on, or even if it did under its own weight, it would start to flop. And guess what? I did wind up bending the tip a little bit. I managed to bend it mostly back, but there's kind of a weird little S in there if I look closely enough. And I do have to look closely, but I stopped the test because I realized if I continued doing that, it would be very long before I broke the thing. Utility tests. I did these again against the classic USMC, starting with fine carving. USMC. I give it to the EK. Yeah, this is a very keen slicey blade. Even though I can't get my thumb up on the back for leverage, it did just fine. I had actually pretty good edge control with this grip. Very similar result to the classic K-bar, but this one was actually keener for finer carving. Moving up to carving feathers out of a split log. Nice bite. Yeah, it's working really well. Very keen. Close. A bit more of a full-fisted grip on the classic. It was close, but I'm going to say this was the keener tool. Making plant stakes out of long, thin branches for our gardening projects, I'm using some Indian plum. There's two ways I do it. One's kind of like sharpening a pencil. Well, again, pretty good bite. Can't complain about that. Alright, the EK does have better bite. In which case, they both did about equally well. I'm going to say again, the edge on this one, it's just a little bit keener. But the other way I'll do it was with fine, accurate chopping at that tip if I'm in a hurry. Yeah, definitely get a better small chopping action out of the classic. And the handle eats up that shock better. All right. And that's where I'm going to have to give it to the classic K-bar. The tip geometry with the belly higher, a little bit more mass up here on the blade made that fine chopping work better than this light keen tip did. That also came up when I tried a quick side-by-side test chopping into a fir branch. Now, I'm probably not going to recommend knives like these for chopping, but who knows, it might be the only tool you have for that. Interesting that the classic K-bar did a somewhat better job. I just felt, again, because it has a bit more mass up here, that it's a more solid chopper. And in that case, the leather grip, I felt, did eat up shock a little bit better than this one. And then finally, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily recommend batoning with either one of these knives. But as I've talked about in other videos, when it comes to splitting small kindling, I prefer to do it by batoning with a sturdy field knife because it feels, well, more accurate, controllable, safe than trying to split something that small with a hawk or a hatchet or an axe or something like that. And I was careful. I picked a branch that was only about 3 inches so I can hit either side of the blade without hitting the guard or the handle. That was unexpected. Interesting result. Well, first of all, one thing unexpected, the branch I batoned through with the EK already had a crack in it. So once the blade got about 1/3 of the way in, it split the log in the opposite direction and then went clean through it, no problem. But I'm going to say the classic K-bar did better because its edge cross-section is a bit more of a wedge, but also because I have a smaller false edge on the classic. It wasn't tearing up my baton as much, and I wasn't so worried about hitting it here where that tip might potentially be fragile. So even though people are afraid of the fragility of the classic, I was actually willing to pound on it harder. Now, if I didn't have the guard on this, I would consider even hitting it up here where the tang is exposed on the handle. But again, a little bit of a give and take in the geometry. All right, as always, it's time to have our conversation about the balance between utility and martial usefulness that can make for an awesome overall carry tool and help with optics. To paraphrase the wisdom of Jorge Prina, the knife that you use the most for the most things becomes the one that's most familiar to you, and that familiarity could carry over to doing, shall we say, other things with it. But I'm going to say, as a utility tool, this really surprised me, especially in terms of its ability to slice and carve. Though that tip really does scare me. I'm going to have to take it easy with that. Utility-wise, I actually think I'd get some more use out of this if I did either take off the back flange of the guard or just remove the guard entirely, at least for certain tasks. But there were certain tasks that my old classic actually did a little bit better or about the same. And speaking of tasks, I did carry and use it for several days around the house, did some carving and trimming and debarking in my forest of a backyard, little light chopping, cut up some cardboard and packaging, and yeah, this was a better slicer again than I thought it would be, though it is a little big for cutting up boxes with. I actually also, even though there is, well, a bit of texture on the blade, took the risk of trying a little food prep with it, and it did fine. It was a little hard to clean, but not bad as an overall utility knife. Again, certainly better than I thought it would be. But this is where we have to talk about optics. If you happen to be anywhere where there are people sensitive to you being armed, and some of those people might be law enforcement, being able to justify your carry as a tool and calling it a tool and having it look more like a tool than a weapon can be very helpful. And this is where I'm going to say this knife does kind of fall short. Wearing it because of that longer, narrower handle, it does look more like a stiletto, more like a tactical weapon on your hip. Now, this certainly is a readily recognizable classic military design, but if I had this with me, I would expect most people would just assume I'm a nostalgic old guy. which I am. So the Classic might have a bit of an advantage there. But as I've talked about many times in my area when it comes to a fixed blade, in public I have to open carry. And that always draws the wrong kind of attention in what we'll call more civilized places versus being out in the woods, out in the field, out in the wilderness, normal forest of a backyard. So yeah, not something I'm going to want to carry in public. Martially, first, I really like the way this knife deploys from its sheath. Got a nice long handle, plenty of real estate, I can find it easily, and like I said, all I need to do is cant it a little bit away from my body to get a really smooth draw. The added bonus is I can orient the blade in either direction in the sheath, depending on my preference. But in talking about what the blade can do, I'm going to separate it by edge versus tip, and we'll start with the edge. This is starting to give me enough blade length that I feel more confident using the edge than I would with a shorter knife. And speaking of its length, I am naturally finding myself indexing the middle of my hand around what I'm going to call this central riser here. And if you look at that, you'll notice my hand is, well, about an inch down from the guard, which means I've got an extra inch of length, making a 7-inch blade perform like an 8-inch blade. And it also puts the point of balance ahead of my hand instead of in my hand. So for slashing, especially with that keen tip, and yeah, the way it rocks in my hand for snap cutting, I really feel like I can get some good use out of it. Since it also encourages a very strong full-fisted grip, I feel like at close range, I could also simply just press the edge into media for that kind of cutting action. Something you definitely see in reverse grip. And we've talked about my short knife paradox. That for me, if a blade gets to be too long, I feel like I start losing tip control in the reverse grip. Also leverage in slashing and cutting. Where a shorter blade, I really feel like I can press it into material should I get the opportunity at very close range. Well, with the grip this thing kind of insists I have on it, I feel like I have some of that reverse cutting action at different angles of the clock. But we also have to talk about orienting the blade in the other direction. With the edge facing away from me, I have this sharpened false edge to hook a back cut with or just get more cutting action out of the stab. In the forward grip with the edge facing away from me, yeah, that could be very functionally effective at back cutting. But if I rotate the edge towards me, which gives me more natural cutting action in the stab, made a better channel, now it leads with this kind of sharpened hook for slashing and snap cutting. So that's pretty awesome. So even though I feel pretty confident with what I can do with the edge, in a real or realistic, fast, chaotic, adrenalized, unpredictable reactive engagement, I'm still going to say I am going to be more confident in what I can do with the tip than the edge. Or combinations of tip and edge together can also be effective, but probably not just the use of my edge unless I get that right target, right opportunity. And you never know. But when it comes to the use of the tip, there are certain things that this knife's geometry favor and don't. And I'm going to start with what scares me. I've already told you I'm concerned with how thin that tip is, how easy it might be to bend or break, depending on what I hit and how I hit it. Also, from the tests, you saw how this knife often got stuck in target media. Now, a knife with a flared pommel would naturally give me something to pull on. I can kind of do that with the central riser if I grip down on it. The other thing I might do is reach an index finger over the top of the guard and pull on that like I would do with a subhill. But since I'm naturally grabbing this lower with my stubby fingers, it's a longer reach, so it's just not as readily available to me. So if my knife were to get stuck in something at the wrong time, that could be bad. But the biggest thing I have to consider is what this grip does in terms of favoring stabbing over thrusting. If you don't know my definitions, thrusting, think
sword, something that happens more straight in line with your arm, so it's a straighter line attack. It's longer reach, tends to be faster, but it is also not as powerful as a good solid full-fisted stab from something like a hammer grip, which is going to, well, curve. You get a lot more leverage impact behind it, but it does limit your range. It does, though, go around corners very effectively and get into openings, but you have to be close. So there's a give and take, and I think I've already told you which one of those two this grip favors. But I can compensate a little bit. The more extended I get in my grip, the less secure it feels, and I start feeling slippage. Do I feel like I'm going to totally lose control of the knife? Well, again, in chaotic situation, something hits my hand, hits my knife, or my knife hits something just wrong, it might get dislodged. That is a concern. So my compensation is, well, one, with the edge facing away from me, I just don't extend it as far. I keep it to a fairly conservative handshake. I'm not going to use a saber because I don't want what's going to happen if my thumbnail collides with that guard under impact. It's going to be a really unhappy day. Could also potentially use foil grip with my thumb on the side. My thumb is actually kind of digging into that top screw for extra grippiness. It's kind of nice. But if I turn the edge towards me, it changes the angle of the tip in terms of its engagement on target. Makes it naturally more straight in line with my arm as compared to that. So I don't have to extend my hand as far. Also in the target media, anything I was doing with the edge facing towards me in terms of stab or thrust made a much better channel due to the natural cutting action into the target media. That is also going to be true in a reverse grip. Now in a reverse grip, there is no equivalent to thrust. I can retract the weapon up against my arm to void it. There are certain parries you can do this way with bigger blades that I'm not really going to want to try to get away with this one. But I'm mostly going to be using it in an ice pick. And yeah, it's a very powerful grip. And with the edge facing towards me, again, I'm getting that natural cutting action. It's making a bigger channel into target media. Now, I wasn't there, and I haven't seen any video of it, if it exists. But I'm assuming when John Eck did his demonstration in front of the review board, when he stabbed his knife into a wooden table, he did it in reverse grip. And yeah, this grip design in reverse grip, I've got a whole lot of confidence in it. Couple, three more pieces of business, martially speaking, before we close. Starting with, I mentioned my concern with the lack of directionality of the grip, that sometimes when I draw it or pick it up without looking, I don't know which way my blade is facing. With this knife design, is that a big deal? If I had to deploy this knife in an emergency, in a hurry, martially speaking, I'm going to say no. When it comes to the tip, we talked about how it performs somewhat differently in the forward and reverse grip, depending on which way your edge is facing, but all of those possibilities are still effective. Well, what about the edge? I can certainly see where it might be embarrassing if you go to cut with this and realize your edge is facing the wrong way. But if it is, you still have a nice, long, sharp, and recurved false edge to slash or snap cut with. So you can still make use of it. And the same is true in the reverse grip. Yeah, you can slash on the forward stroke even with the blade facing towards you. Next piece of business is what you just saw me do. Transitioning from forward to reverse grip, yes, this knife is balanced and narrow enough that it is tempting me to dance it through my fingers, do my bad habit finger twirling. I've been doing it for decades and decades. It is reflex. I don't know I'm doing it until I've done it most of the time. But I don't recommend you do it because it's really easy to fumble, especially under adrenaline in chaos. And if you fumble a live blade, it's going to be bad. So just don't. My ultimate recommendation is never transition a knife when you're within reach of your opponent or if adrenaline has destroyed your fine motor coordination, which is why I train with my knife in all grips. But if you're going to do it, get some distance and some time and some calm, and your best bet is to do it in two hands. And having, well, fairly long blade with most of its spine not being sharp, and a long grip gives me all sorts of real estate options for transitioning this in two hands, which is your safest option if you're going to do it. But if your other hand is busy, or if you're training and you get lazy like I do, and you just want to do it in one hand to make it quicker, I'm going to recommend a pinch flip. And with this knife, that bottom screw makes a great indexing point and adds a little bit of grip. So just getting my thumb and forefinger right there, there are no pommel obstructions to snag on my stubby fingers. That works pretty well. So if you're going to do it in one hand, this would be my recommendation. Final piece of business. Talked about how that tang extends past the grip panels. From the earliest designs, this was referred to as a skull crusher. It's an impact tool, backed up by a pretty firm grip on these grip shapes. And because it's a sharp-cornered piece of steel, it would probably also make an effective glass breaker. Could I use this as a hammer in the field if I had nothing else? Well, I could. I don't think it's going to damage the knife, but I think it would be really awkward, and you'd do better with almost anything else. You could improvise, rock, stick, whatever. Okay. I wasn't sure about this knife the first couple of days I was training with it. There were some things about it that were awkward. I had some concerns, but the more I've worked with it, the more I've really come to like it, to appreciate it. Now, the fragility of the tip remains my biggest concern. So here I am thinking about the EK45, the dagger, which looks like, with its cross-section, to have a much more reinforced point. If you have one, give me your thoughts on it. And then I'll put it on my wish list, and we'll get around to it eventually as a review. But until then, as always, thank you all so much for watching, liking, subscribing, following my journey, putting up with my madness, adding to our conversation. And I hope to see you back for one of the things I promised is folding knives with shorter blades for those of us who live under blade length restrictions.